The sound of silence. The morphine hadn't worn off yet, but Susan could already feel the dull ache beginning to pulse through her right knee. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and that peculiar staleness that seemed to cling to medical facilities, no matter how often they were cleaned. Through the narrow window, she watched the parking lot fill and empty as visiting hours came and went. Dr. Martinez had been clear about the recovery timeline: 6 to 8 weeks of limited mobility, physical therapy 3 times a week, no weight-bearing for the first month. The torn meniscus and damaged cartilage had required more extensive repair than initially anticipated, but the surgery had gone well. "You'll be good as new," he'd promised, with the confident smile surgeons reserved for successful procedures. Susan shifted carefully in the hospital bed, wincing as the movement sent a sharp reminder through her leg. At 68, this wasn't how she'd imagined spending her golden years. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent decades on her feet as a high school English teacher, only to be laid low by a simple misstep while gardening. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, a text from her daughter, Dr. Rebecca Walsh. "Surgery went well, I heard. Dad and I can't make it tonight. Emergency at the hospital. See you tomorrow." Susan stared at the message for a long moment. Emergency at the hospital. Rebecca was an orthopedic surgeon herself, ironically, specializing in the very type of procedure Susan had just undergone. The demands of her profession were intense. Susan knew that. She'd supported Rebecca through medical school, residency, fellowship, emotionally and financially. The $200,000 in student loans she had co-signed, the down payment for David and Rebecca's house when they were starting out, the countless babysitting hours for their children now grown and in college. She understood. She'd always understood. The next morning brought a parade of nurses with cheerful dispositions and efficient movements, physical therapy evaluation, discharge planning, insurance forms. Susan's head spun with instructions about wound care, medication schedules, and follow-up appointments. Through it all, she kept glancing at the door, expecting to see Rebecca's familiar silhouette. "Is someone coming to pick you up, Mrs. Walsh?" the discharge nurse asked, consulting her clipboard. "My daughter. She's a surgeon here, actually. Dr. Rebecca Walsh." The nurse's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, Dr. Walsh. She's excellent. I'm sure she'll be here soon." But Rebecca didn't come. At 3 o'clock, Susan called her. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We've got back-to-back surgeries today. David's picking you up, okay? He'll get you home safely." David arrived 20 minutes late, still in his business suit, checking his phone constantly. Susan's son-in-law had always been pleasant enough, successful in commercial real estate, well-dressed, well-spoken, but there was something about him that had always felt hollow to Susan, like a beautiful house with no foundation. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though his attention was clearly divided between her and whatever was demanding his attention on his phone screen. "Better, thank you. The doctor says—" "That's great." Rebecca filled me in. He glanced around the hospital room. "You ready? I've got a client call at 4. The ride home was punctuated by David's phone conversation about property investments and market projections. Susan sat in the passenger seat, her leg elevated awkwardly, watching familiar neighborhoods roll past the window. Her own house, the modest ranch where she'd raised Rebecca as a single mother after her husband died, looked smaller somehow when they pulled into the driveway. Getting from the car to her front door required careful maneuvering with the walker the hospital had provided. David helped perfunctorily, his movements quick and efficient, but lacking warmth. At the door, he handed her the bag of medication and discharge papers. "Rebecca said she'll call you later to check in," he said, already backing toward his car. "Take care, Susan." And then he was gone, leaving Susan alone with her walker, her pain medication, and the sudden, crushing realization of what the next 6 to 8 weeks would look like. The house felt different. The hallway that had never seemed long before now stretched like an endless corridor. The bathroom, usually a few simple steps from her bedroom, might as well have been on another planet. Every surface seemed too high or too low, every movement a calculated risk. Susan made it to her bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted from the simple act of getting inside her own home. Her knee throbbed with a deep, bone-deep ache that made her nauseous. She reached for the prescription bottle, struggled with the child-proof cap, and finally managed to shake out one of the pain pills. The silence in the house was deafening. For the first few days, Susan managed. She ordered groceries online, she kept her leg elevated as instructed, she did the exercises the physical therapist had shown her, gritting her teeth through each repetition. Rebecca called twice, brief conversations sandwiched between surgeries or meetings. "How's the pain level?" Rebecca would ask. "Manageable," Susan would lie. "Physical therapy going on?" "Fine." "Great, I'll try to stop by this weekend." But the weekend came and went without a visit. And the next weekend. And the next. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks post-surgery, that Susan's carefully constructed independence began to crumble. She'd been trying to change the sheets on her bed, a task that required more bending and reaching than she'd anticipated. The walker caught on the corner of the mattress, sending her off balance. She didn't fall completely, but the twist she made to catch herself sent lightning through her knee and left her gasping on the half-made bed. For the first time since coming home, Susan cried. Not from the physical pain, though that was substantial, but from the crushing loneliness, the realization that she was truly alone in this recovery. Her daughter, the successful surgeon she'd sacrificed so much to support, was too busy to check on her own mother. She reached for her phone and dialed Rebecca's number. "Mom, what's wrong? I'm about to go into surgery." "I need help," Susan said, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "I can't manage alone anymore. I can't clean, I can barely make meals, Mom, you're being dramatic. It's been 3 weeks. You should be getting better by now." "The doctor said 6 to 8 weeks. Look, I know you're frustrated, but you're tougher than you think you are. You raised me alone after Dad died, remember? You can handle a little knee surgery." "Rebecca, please, I'm not asking for much. Maybe someone could come help with groceries or—" "Mom, I need to go. David and I both work full-time. We have our own lives, our own responsibilities. We can't drop everything every time you need something." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Rebecca's voice returned, softer but still distant. "Look, maybe you should look into hiring someone, a home health aide or something. Insurance might cover it." "I don't want a stranger. I want my family." "Mom, we'll talk about this later. I really have to go." The line went dead. Susan stared at the phone in her hand, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. It wasn't just disappointment or hurt, but recognition. A moment of terrible clarity about the relationship she'd spent decades building and maintaining. She thought about the $50,000 she'd given Rebecca and David for their house down payment, money she'd saved working double shifts at the private school where she'd taught evening classes for extra income. The Christmas gifts, the birthday checks, the co-signed loans, the investment account she'd set up in Rebecca's name when she'd started making good money, the trust fund she'd established for the grandchildren, the life insurance policy with Rebecca as the sole beneficiary. All of it given freely, gladly, because that's what mothers do. That's what love looks like. Isn't it? The next morning, Susan called Rebecca again. "I need you to come over," she said without preamble. "Today." "I can't just—" "Today," Susan repeated. "Or I'm calling an ambulance and telling them I can't care for myself. Your choice." 3 hours later, Rebecca stood in Susan's living room, her scrubs wrinkled, her face tight with irritation. "This is ridiculous, Mom. You look fine." Susan, who had spent 20 minutes that morning struggling to put on a clean shirt, studied her daughter's face. Rebecca had always been beautiful, tall like her father, with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes. Success looked good on her. The expensive watch, the designer bag, the confidence that came with having people hang on your every word. "I can't keep living like this," Susan said. "So hire someone to help you." I shouldn't have to hire someone. I have a family. Rebecca sighed. That particular sound she'd perfected in medical school when dealing with difficult patients. Mom, David and I are not your personal nurses. We have careers, responsibilities. We can't just drop everything every time you have a medical issue. The words hung in the air like a slap. We are not your nurses. Susan felt something cold and final settle in her stomach. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. You're right, Susan said quietly. You're not my nurses. Rebecca's expression softened slightly, perhaps thinking she'd gotten through to her mother. Good. I'm glad you understand. Look, I know this is hard, but you're stronger than you think. You'll get through this. After Rebecca left, Susan sat in her living room for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. The house was quiet, except for the tick of the clock on the mantel and the occasional car passing on the street outside. She thought about the last 30 years of her life, the sacrifices she'd made, the boundaries she'd never established, the word no that had somehow been surgically removed from her vocabulary when it came to Rebecca. Susan had read enough literature in her teaching career to recognize a turning point when she lived one. The moment when everything changes, when the character either grows or remains forever diminished. She reached for her phone. First National Bank, this is Jennifer, how can I help you? I need to freeze some accounts. The process was surprisingly simple. The joint savings account she'd opened when Rebecca was in medical school, frozen. The investment account in Rebecca's name that Susan still controlled, frozen. The credit cards Susan had co-signed for, canceled. Next, she called her attorney, Margaret Chen, whom she'd known since Rebecca was a child. Susan, how are you feeling? I heard about your surgery. I'm fine, Margaret. I need to discuss some property matters. Of course. What can I do for you? The house on Maple Street, the one I bought for Rebecca and David. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What about it? I want them out. Another pause. Susan, are you sure about this? You've been through a lot with your surgery and recovery. Maybe you should take some time before making any major decisions. I'm not impaired. I'm clear-headed for the first time in years. The house is in my name. I want to begin eviction proceedings. That's going to be a 30-day notice in this state. Are you prepared for the family complications this might cause? Susan looked around her empty house, thinking about the silence that had become her constant companion. What family complications? She asked. The next morning, Susan felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Energy. Not physical energy, her knee still ached and the walker was still a necessary companion, but mental energy. Purpose. The feeling of forward motion after weeks of stagnation. She called a home healthcare service and arranged for someone to come 3 times a week. Not because Rebecca had suggested it, but because Susan decided she needed it. The woman who arrived for the initial assessment was named Maria, a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes and capable hands. You need help with cooking, cleaning, some personal care? Maria asked, making notes on her tablet. Yes, Susan said, and I need someone to talk to occasionally. Maria smiled. That comes free with the service. The eviction notice was served on a Thursday. Susan had asked Margaret to handle it professionally. No drama, just the legal facts. Rebecca called within an hour. What is the hell is this, Mom? It's an eviction notice. I can see that. Why are you doing this to us? I'm not doing anything to you. I'm doing something for me. This is about the nursing thing, isn't it? You're punishing us because we wouldn't drop our lives to take care of you. Susan was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, she could see Maria in the garden, weeding the flower beds that Susan hadn't been able to tend since her surgery. Maria had offered to help with the outdoor work, saying she enjoyed gardening. No, Susan said finally. This isn't punishment. This is recognition. Recognition of what? That I raised a daughter who thinks her mother asking for help during a medical recovery is an unreasonable burden? Mom, that's not fair. That I gave you everything I had for 30 years and got a lecture on personal responsibility when I needed something in return? You're being melodramatic. That you're 43 years old and still living in a house your mother bought for you while telling that same mother that she's asking too much when she needs help changing her sheets? The silence on the line stretched long enough that Susan wondered if Rebecca had hung up. "You can't do this," Rebecca said finally. "I can, and I am." "Where are we supposed to go? David's business is here, my practice is here. You're both successful adults with good incomes. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You have 30 days. I can't believe you're doing this over something so petty." And there it was. The casual dismissal, the minimizing, the refusal to acknowledge that Susan's needs might be legitimate. All the patterns that Susan had somehow failed to see when she was in the middle of them. If my need for basic human kindness during a medical recovery is petty to you, then you've proven my point better than I ever could have. She hung up before Rebecca could respond. David showed up that evening, still in his work clothes, his face flushed with anger. "Susan, we need to talk." "No, we don't." Susan remained seated in her living room chair, her leg elevated on an ottoman. "Everything I have to say was in the legal notice." "This is insane. You're destroying your relationship with your daughter over a misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding?" David sat down, uninvited, on the couch across from her. "Rebecca told me what happened. You asked for help. She explained that we both have demanding careers. You got upset. It's all just a miscommunication." Susan studied her son-in-law's face. He was handsome in a generic way, the kind of person who looked like he'd stepped out of a stock photo for successful businessman. But there was something missing in his eyes, some fundamental lack of comprehension. "David, do you know how much money I've given you and Rebecca over the years?" "Susan, this isn't about money. The medical school loans I co-signed, the house down payment, the credit cards, the investment account, the trust funds for your children. Do you know what the total amount is?" David shifted uncomfortably. "We've always been grateful." "Over $400,000, Susan said. $400,000 I've given to support your family over the years. And we appreciate. When I couldn't change my sheets without risking injury to my surgical site, your wife told me you're not my nurses." David was quiet now, perhaps beginning to see the mathematics of the situation. "I'm not asking for $400,000 worth of help. I was asking for basic human decency from people I've supported unconditionally for decades." "Susan, you're right. We should have handled it better. Let us make it up to you. We can—" "No." The word felt clean in Susan's mouth, sharp and final. "You had your chance to handle it better. You chose not to. So you're going to throw away your relationship with your daughter and grandchildren over this?" Susan thought about that question for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the sound of children playing in the neighborhood, their laughter carrying on the evening air. "David, what relationship?" she asked. "When was the last time Rebecca visited me when she didn't need something? When was the last time she called just to talk? When was the last time she remembered my birthday without Facebook reminding her?" David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. "I'm not throwing away a relationship," Susan said. "I'm finally admitting that the relationship I thought I had was mostly in my imagination." After David left, Susan sat in the growing darkness of her living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. The house felt different than it had in weeks. Not empty, quiet. There was a difference. Her phone buzzed with text messages. Rebecca, then David, then Rebecca again. She didn't read them. Instead, she turned the phone off and set it aside. The pain medication made her drowsy, but her mind felt clearer than it had in years. She thought about the students she'd taught over the decades, the countless essays about literature and life she'd graded. How many times had she written in the margins, "What is the character learning about themselves in this moment?" What was Susan learning about herself? That she'd spent 30 years mistaking generosity for love, giving for receiving, sacrifice for relationship. That she'd been so afraid of being alone that she'd accepted scraps of attention and called it family. That she'd raised a daughter who saw her mother's resources as an entitlement and her needs as an inconvenience. But more than that, She was learning that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that the approval she'd spent a lifetime seeking from Rebecca wasn't actually necessary for her survival, that at 68, it wasn't too late to start living on her own terms. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. Maria came 3 times a week, and Susan found herself looking forward to the visits, not just for the practical help, but for the conversation. Maria was raising 2 teenagers alone while caring for her aging mother, and her matter-of-fact approach to life's challenges was both inspiring and comforting. "My daughter, she thinks I should put my mother in a home. She says it's too much work for me." "What do you think?" Susan asked. "I think family takes care of family. That's what we do. My mother, she sacrificed for me when I was young. Now it's my turn." Susan felt a pang at those words, but it wasn't the sharp pain of earlier weeks. It was more like the ache of a healed bone on a rainy day. Present, but manageable. Rebecca tried to visit twice during the 30-day notice period, but Susan declined to see her. Margaret Chen had advised her that any direct communication during the eviction process could complicate things legally. But the truth was simpler. Susan wasn't ready. She needed time to figure out who she was without the constant need to please her daughter. The physical therapy was progressing well. Susan's knee was getting stronger, her range of motion improving. Dr. Martinez was pleased with her progress. "You're healing faster than I expected for someone your age," he told her during a follow-up appointment. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What she was doing was living without the constant stress of managing Rebecca's moods and demands. The relief was apparently therapeutic. On a Wednesday morning, exactly 30 days after the eviction notice was served, Susan received a call from Margaret. "They're out," Margaret said. "The house is empty." Susan felt something shift in her chest, a loosening she hadn't expected. "Any problems?" "None. David left the keys with the neighbor and asked me to give you this." Margaret read from what sounded like a prepared statement. "Please tell Susan that we'll be staying with friends until we can find a suitable rental. Rebecca wants her to know that she's hurt and confused by this whole situation, but she hopes they can eventually work things out." "That's it?" Susan thanked Margaret and hung up. She sat in her living room, looking around at the space that had been her sanctuary during recovery. In a few weeks, she'd be fully mobile again. She could travel, maybe take that trip to Ireland she'd always talked about. She could volunteer somewhere meaningful, maybe tutor struggling students or help at a literacy center. For the first time in years, her time was entirely her own. The realization should have felt liberating, and it did, but it also felt sad in a way that Susan was still processing. She grieved for the relationship she had wanted with Rebecca, even as she felt relief at being free from the relationship she'd actually had. Maria arrived that afternoon for her usual visit and found Susan sitting in the garden, watching the flowers she had planted years ago bloom in the spring sunshine. "You look peaceful today," Maria observed. "I feel peaceful." And Susan was surprised to realize it was true. "Your daughter," she called again. Susan had told Maria some of the situation, enough for Maria to understand the family dynamics at play. "No, and I think she won't for a while." "That makes you sad?" Susan considered the question. "Yes and no. It makes me sad that we never had the relationship I thought we had, but it makes me hopeful that maybe now I can build the life I actually want, instead of the life I thought would make her happy." Maria nodded, continuing to weed the flower bed with efficient movements. "My daughter, when she was 16, she told me she hated me, said I was too strict, too old-fashioned, too everything. It broke my heart." "What happened?" "Nothing. I kept loving her, kept being her mother, but I stopped trying to be her friend, stopped trying to make her happy all the time. She was angry for maybe 2 years. And then?" Maria smiled. "And then she grew up. Now she tells me I was right about most things, says she wants to raise her children the way I raised her." Susan felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, but she pushed it down. Rebecca was 43, not 16. The patterns they'd established were decades in the making. "Maybe it's different when they're adults," Susan said. "Maybe," Maria agreed. But maybe not. Maybe love looks different than we think it should. That evening, Susan did something she hadn't done in months. She called an old friend. Janet Morrison had been her colleague for 15 years before retiring and moving to Arizona. They'd kept in touch sporadically, Christmas cards and the occasional email, but their friendship had been one of the many casualties of Susan's increasing focus on Rebecca's needs and demands. "Susan, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you feeling? I heard about your surgery through the grapevine." They talked for an hour about Susan's recovery, about Janet's new life in Arizona, about books they'd read and places they wanted to visit. It felt like coming home to a part of herself Susan had forgotten existed. "You sound different," Janet said near the end of the call. "Happier, somehow." "I think I might be." "Good for you. I'm coming back to town next month for my granddaughter's graduation. Maybe we could have lunch." "I'd love that." After they hung up, Susan realized it had been years since she'd made social plans that didn't revolve around Rebecca's schedule or needs. The freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying. 2 weeks later, Susan was strong enough to drive short distances. Her first solo trip was to the bank, where she met with the financial advisor she'd worked with for years. "I need to restructure some things," she told him. She closed the joint accounts, removed Rebecca from the investment accounts, and set up new beneficiary designations that included several charities she'd always supported. The trust funds for her grandchildren remained. They were innocent in all this, and Susan's anger with Rebecca didn't extend to punishing children. But the financial safety net she'd provided for her daughter for 3 decades was officially retired. "This is a significant change," the advisor said carefully. "Are you sure about this timing? Sometimes after a medical event, people make decisions they later regret." Susan thought about that. It was possible that her clarity was temporary, that the hurt and anger would fade and she'd want to rebuild the old patterns. But sitting in the bank office, signing papers that formally acknowledged her independence, she couldn't imagine ever going back to the person she'd been before her surgery. That person had been afraid of being alone, afraid of disappointing people, afraid that love was something you had to earn with constant giving and sacrifice. This person, the one she was becoming, understood that love without boundaries wasn't love at all, but a kind of elaborate performance that left everyone exhausted and empty. A month later, Susan was walking without assistance, driving regularly, and making plans to put her own house on the market. She decided to downsize to a condo in the Arts District downtown, somewhere with less maintenance and more community, somewhere she could start fresh. Rebecca called on a Thursday evening. "Mom, we need to talk." Susan's first instinct was to say yes immediately, to drop everything and make herself available. But she caught herself. "About what?" "About this whole situation. About us. About the family. But not tonight. I have plans." It was true. Susan was having dinner with Janet, who was in town for the graduation she'd mentioned. Their lunch the previous week had been so enjoyable that they'd made another date. Plans? What kind of plans? Susan almost answered, almost fell back into the old pattern of explaining and justifying her time, but she caught herself again. "Plans with a friend. We can talk this weekend if you'd like." The pause on Rebecca's end was long enough that Susan wondered if she was still there. "A friend?" "Yes, Janet Morrison. You remember her, she taught with me for years." "Oh." Rebecca sounded genuinely surprised, as if the idea of Susan having independent friendships had never occurred to her. "Well, can't you reschedule?" "No, I can't, but I'm free Saturday afternoon if you'd like to come over." Another pause. "Fine. I'll come by around 2. After Susan hung up, she realized her hands weren't shaking. She wasn't anxious about the conversation or already planning what she would say to make Rebecca feel better. She was simply present, preparing to have dinner with a friend, and that felt like progress. Saturday arrived gray and rainy, the kind of day that had always made Susan feel melancholy. But as she prepared for Rebecca's visit, she felt only a mild curiosity about how the conversation would go. Rebecca arrived precisely at 2. looking tired and older than Susan remembered. The stress of the move, of rebuilding their financial stability, was evident in the lines around her eyes. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Rebecca. Come in." They sat in the living room where so many of their conversations had taken place over the years. But something was different now. Susan wasn't perched on the edge of her seat, eager to please and quick to apologize. She was simply present, waiting. "I don't understand what happened," Rebecca began. "We had a disagreement about your recovery, and suddenly you've turned our whole lives upside down. What don't you understand? Why are you punishing us so severely for one conversation? We're family, Mom. Families work through disagreements. I know that you're right that families work through disagreements, but what we had wasn't a disagreement. It was a revelation." "A revelation?" "About what our relationship actually is versus what I thought it was." Rebecca leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mom, I love you. You know that. I've always loved you. I believe you do love me, in your way, but your way of loving involves me giving and you receiving, with very little reciprocation. That's not fair. I've been busy building my career." "For 30 years?" The question hung in the air between them. "Rebecca, when was the last time you did something for me that I didn't ask for? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you remembered something important to me without being reminded?" Rebecca opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. "When you were building your career, I was proud to support you. But somewhere along the way, supporting you became my entire identity, and receiving support became yours. When I needed something from you for once, your response was to tell me I wasn't your nurse. I was stressed. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. How did you mean it?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Her eyes settled on the photo on the side table. Susan and Rebecca at her medical school graduation, both beaming with pride. "I meant that I couldn't drop everything in my life every time you needed something. I wasn't asking you to drop everything. I was asking for help during a medical recovery. Help that I needed because I'd been too proud to ask for it sooner, and by the time I did ask, I was in real difficulty. You're right. I should have handled it better. I'm sorry. I appreciate that, but I don't think an apology changes the fundamental issue, which is what? That you've never learned to see me as a person with my own needs and limitations. You see me as a resource, someone who provides financial support, emotional labor, and practical help, but who doesn't require the same in return. That's not true, isn't it? In 30 years, how many times have you offered to help me with something I didn't ask for? How many times have you checked on my well-being without wanting something in return? How many times have you considered what I might need from our relationship?" The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. "I never thought about it that way," Rebecca said finally. "I know, and that's the problem." Susan stood up, walking to the window despite the slight stiffness remaining in her knee. The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. "I spent decades believing that if I gave you everything you needed, eventually you'd start giving back. That if I was patient enough, generous enough, understanding enough, you'd recognize my needs without me having to ask. Mom, but that's not how it works. I taught you that my needs were less important than yours. I taught you that I would always say yes, always accommodate, always put your well-being ahead of my own. I taught you to take me for granted. And that wasn't fair to either of us. So what do you want from me?" It was, Susan realized, the first time Rebecca had asked that question in recent memory. "I want you to learn to see me as a whole person, someone with needs and limitations and the right to have boundaries. Someone whose time and energy are valuable, whose feelings matter, whose well-being is worth considering." "And if I do that?" Susan considered the question carefully. "Then maybe we can build a real relationship, not one based on me giving and you taking, but one based on mutual respect and consideration." "And the house? The money? What about them? Are you going to give them back?" Susan almost smiled at the phrasing, "give them back." as if they had been Rebecca's to begin with. "The house was never yours, Rebecca. It was always mine. I allowed you to live there because I wanted to help you get established. But you're 43 years old. You don't need me to house you anymore. And the money I gave you over the years was gifts, freely given. But the ongoing financial support stops now. You're successful adults. You can support yourselves." Rebecca sat back in her chair, looking stunned. "I don't understand. If I learn to be a better daughter, you won't help us anymore anyway?" "Rebecca, do you hear yourself? You're asking me what you can do to get me to resume supporting you financially. You're not asking how you can be a better daughter because you want a better relationship with your mother. You're asking because you want the benefits that come with my approval." The realization seemed to hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and for the first time since arriving, she looked genuinely distressed rather than frustrated or angry. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That is what I am doing." They sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, Susan could hear the sound of children playing in the sunshine that had emerged after the rain. Normal life, continuing in its normal rhythms. "I don't know how to do this differently," Rebecca said finally. "I don't know how to be a daughter instead of whatever I've been." For the first time since her surgery, Susan felt a flicker of hope for their relationship. "I don't know either," she admitted. "I only know how to be the kind of mother I was, which apparently wasn't very helpful for either of us. So what do we do?" Susan thought about that question. It was the right question, finally. Not what Susan could do for Rebecca, but what they could do together. "We start over, I think. We learn to be adults who happen to be related rather than a mother and daughter stuck in patterns we established when you were a child." That sounds scary. It is scary, but I think it might also be better than what we had. Rebecca stood up, gathering her purse and keys. "I need to think about all this." "I understand." At the door, Rebecca hesitated. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happier now, without us in your life?" Susan considered the question carefully. "I'm different now. Lonelier in some ways, but also more peaceful. More myself, if that makes sense." "It does, actually." Rebecca's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I think I've been so focused on having you in my life that I never thought about whether I was actually good for your life." Susan felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "That is the most insightful thing you've said in years," she said softly. After Rebecca left, Susan sat in her quiet house as the evening light faded to darkness. She didn't turn on the television or pick up a book. She simply sat with the silence, which no longer felt empty, but full of possibility. Her phone rang an hour later. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen, and Susan found herself hesitating before answering. The old Susan would have grabbed the phone immediately, eager to smooth over any discomfort from their conversation, but this Susan took a moment to consider whether she wanted to engage further today. She let it go to voicemail. The message was brief. "Mom, I just wanted to say thank you today for telling me the truth even though it was hard to hear. I love you." Susan played the message twice, surprised by how different it sounded from Rebecca's usual communications. There was no request, no agenda, no attempt to manage Susan's emotions, just a simple expression of gratitude and affection. It was, Susan realized, the kind of message she'd been hoping to receive from her daughter for decades. The next few months passed quietly. Susan sold her house and moved to the downtown condo as planned. The process of downsizing forced her to confront 30 years of accumulated possessions, each item a small decision about what version of herself she wanted to carry forward. She kept the books, the photos, the furniture that brought her joy. She donated Rebecca's childhood artwork and school projects, the baby clothes she'd saved just in case, the gifts that had been given out of obligation rather than love. Each bag that left her house felt like shedding old skin. The condo was smaller but filled with light. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a small park where she could watch the seasons change. There was a coffee shop downstairs, a library within walking distance, and neighbors who smiled and made conversation in the elevator. For the first time in years, Susan felt like she was living somewhere rather than simply existing. She joined a book club, started volunteering at the literacy center, and began taking the writing class she'd been talking about for years. Her knee healed completely, stronger than it had been before the injury. Dr. Martinez joked that she seemed to have gotten younger during her recovery. "Whatever you're doing, it's working," he told her during her final follow-up appointment. "I'm living my own life," Susan said, and meant it. Rebecca called every few weeks, brief conversations that gradually became more natural. She didn't ask for money or help or advice. Instead, she shared small details about her work, asked about Susan's new activities, mentioned books she was reading or movies she'd enjoyed. It took Susan several months to realize that Rebecca was learning how to make conversation with her mother rather than simply managing her as a resource. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in November. Susan was reading in her living room when her phone rang. "Mom, I'm sorry to call so late. I know you're usually winding down by now." Susan glanced at the clock. It was 8:30. Not particularly late, but Rebecca had clearly been paying attention to Susan's routines. "It's fine. What's going on?" "I had a difficult surgery today. Lost a patient. A young man. Motorcycle accident. I did everything right, but sometimes that's not enough." Susan felt her maternal instincts rise, the familiar urge to fix and comfort and make everything better. But something held her back. "That sounds heartbreaking," she said instead. "It is. I've been a surgeon for 15 years, and I still don't know how to handle the losses. I feel like I should be stronger by now." "Why should you be stronger? You're not a machine. You're a human being who cares about her patients." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "I never thought about it that way." They talked for 20 minutes. Rebecca shared her doubts and fears about her work, her worry that she wasn't good enough, her struggle to maintain empathy in a profession that demanded emotional distance. Susan listened and offered perspective, but she didn't try to solve or fix or minimize Rebecca's feelings. When they hung up, Susan realized something significant had happened. For the first time in their adult relationship, Rebecca had called simply because she needed her mother. Not her mother's money or help or practical support, but her mother's wisdom and presence. It felt like the conversation Susan had been waiting for her entire life. Christmas arrived with an invitation Susan hadn't expected. Rebecca called in early December, her voice nervous. "Mom, I know this is short notice, and I'll understand if you already have plans, but David and I were wondering if you'd like to have Christmas dinner with us." Susan's first instinct was to say yes immediately, but she caught herself. She had learned to pause, to consider what she actually wanted, rather than what she thought she should want. "Where are you having dinner?" "At our apartment. It's not much, we're still getting settled after the move, but I thought it might be nice to cook together. If you want to." Their apartment. Not the house Susan had bought them, but a place they were renting with their own money. A place that was truly theirs. "I'd like that," Susan said. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright. Susan dressed carefully, choosing a red sweater she'd bought for herself at the beginning of the month. She'd gotten into the habit of buying herself small gifts, little acknowledgments that her own pleasure and comfort mattered. Rebecca and David's apartment was in an older building near the hospital, modest but charming. Rebecca met her at the door, and Susan was struck by how different her daughter looked. Less polished, perhaps, but more present somehow. "Mom, I'm so glad you came." The day unfolded with surprising ease. Susan and Rebecca cooked together, while David watched football and occasionally wandered into the kitchen to sample their progress. The conversation was light, comfortable, free from the undercurrent of tension that had marked so many family gatherings in recent years. Over dinner, David raised his wine glass. "I'd like to make a toast." Susan tensed slightly, unsure what was coming. "To Susan for teaching us both some important lessons this year, and to family, however we define it." It was a small gesture, but it acknowledged something that had been invisible for years, that Susan was a person worthy of recognition and gratitude, not just a source of support to be taken for granted. After dinner, Rebecca walked Susan to her car. "Mom, I have something for you." She handed Susan a small wrapped package. Inside was a photo in a simple frame, Susan and Rebecca at the downtown farmers market, taken during one of their recent Saturday morning outings. Susan was laughing at something Rebecca had said, her face bright with genuine joy. "When did you take this?" "Last month. You looked so happy, and I realized I'd never seen you look quite that way before. Relaxed and yourself." Susan studied the photo, seeing herself through her daughter's eyes. The woman in the picture looked confident, content, fully present in her own life. "I love it," Susan said. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I deserved it." Susan hugged her daughter, feeling the solid warmth of her, the reality of this relationship they were slowly building from scratch. Driving home through the quiet Christmas evening streets, Susan reflected on the day. It hadn't been perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, still patterns they were both working to change, but it had been real in a way their interactions hadn't been for years. The new year brought new routines. Susan's writing class had evolved into a small group of friends who met weekly to share their work and offer feedback. She was working on a memoir about her teaching career, exploring the ways that education had shaped both her students and herself. Rebecca called more regularly now, sometimes just to share small moments from her day. She'd started sending Susan articles she thought might interest her, photos of interesting cases or medical conferences, updates about mutual acquaintances from the hospital where Susan had once been a frequent visitor. It took Susan months to recognize what was happening. Rebecca was learning to include her mother in her life, rather than simply managing her as an obligation. The real test came in March, when Susan developed a mild case of pneumonia. Nothing serious, but it required a few days of rest and careful attention to her symptoms. The old Susan would have minimized the illness, would have struggled through without asking for help to avoid being seen as a burden. But this Susan called Rebecca. "I don't need anything dramatic, but I could use someone to check on me once a day for the next few days, maybe pick up some groceries." "Of course I will," Rebecca said immediately. "I'll come by after work tonight." She arrived with soup from Susan's favorite restaurant, medicine from the pharmacy, and a concerned but calm presence that was exactly what Susan needed. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca asked, settling into the chair beside Susan's bed. "Better, actually. The antibiotics are helping." "Good. Do you need anything else while I'm here?" It was such a simple question, but it represented a fundamental shift. Rebecca was asking what Susan needed, rather than waiting to be told what she should do. "Just the company. Thank you for coming." "Of course I came. You're my mother." But this time, the words didn't feel like an obligation. They felt like a choice, freely made and gladly given. Rebecca visited each day until Susan was fully recovered, bringing small offerings, magazines, herbal tea, updates about her work. She didn't hover or fuss, but she was present, attentive to Susan's actual needs rather than her own assumptions about what a good daughter should provide. On the last evening, as Susan was clearly on the mend, Rebecca lingered after bringing dinner. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you think I'm proud of who I've become? I mean, not my career or achievements, but who I am as a person." Susan considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she would have answered quickly, eager to reassure and please. But Rebecca deserved honesty. "I'm proud of who you're becoming. I see you making difficult changes, examining your own behavior, trying to be better. That takes courage." "And before all this happened?" Susan met her daughter's eyes. "Before, I was proud of your success, but I'm not sure I knew who you were as a person well enough to be proud of that." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I don't think I knew either. Do you now?" "I'm starting to. It turns out I'm someone who can learn from her mistakes, even when they're decades in the making. someone who can apologize and mean it, someone who can put her mother's needs before her own convenience, at least sometimes. That's a good start. Spring arrived with an invitation Susan surprised more than Rebecca's Christmas dinner had. Rebecca called on a Saturday morning, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I know this sounds crazy, but I was wondering if you'd like to take a trip with me." "A trip? I have a medical conference in San Francisco next month, and I thought maybe you'd like to come along. We could extend it a few days, see some sights, maybe visit that bookstore you always talk about." Susan felt a flutter of something that might have been joy. Rebecca was inviting her to share in her professional life, to be a companion rather than a responsibility. "I'd love that," Susan said. "Really? You're not just saying that to be nice. Rebecca, when have you ever known me to travel somewhere just to be nice?" Rebecca laughed. "Fair point. You've gotten pretty good at saying what you actually mean." The trip was a revelation. Susan watched her daughter present her research to a room full of respected colleagues, saw the confidence and competence Rebecca had built over years of dedicated work. For the first time, Susan felt like she was seeing her daughter as the world saw her, not as someone who needed constant support and guidance, but as an accomplished professional who had earned her place through talent and hard work. In the evenings, they explored the city together. They walked through Golden Gate Park, browsed the endless shelves at City Lights bookstore, shared meals at small restaurants Rebecca had researched specifically because Susan had mentioned an interest in trying new cuisines. It felt like getting to know her daughter as an adult for the first time. On their last evening, they sat on the hotel room balcony watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and pink. "This has been wonderful," Susan said. "For me too. I'd forgotten how much fun you are to travel with. We haven't traveled together since you were a child." "Exactly. I'd forgotten that you're actually good company when I'm not treating you like a service provider." Susan smiled at her daughter's bluntness. "And you're good company when you're not trying to manage me as a problem to be solved." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change over the water. "Mom, I have something to tell you," Rebecca said finally. "What's that?" "David and I have been talking and we've decided to pay you back." Susan turned to look at her daughter. "Pay me back for what?" "Everything. The down payment on the house, the medical school loans, all of it. It's going to take us a few years, but we want to do it." "Rebecca, that's not necessary. Those were gifts." "No, they were investments you made in us when we couldn't invest in ourselves. But we can now, and we should. We want to." Susan felt something shift in her understanding of her daughter. This wasn't about guilt or obligation. This was about dignity, about Rebecca claiming full ownership of her own success. "Why is this important to you?" "Because I want to know that our relationship isn't built on financial dependency. I want to know that when you spend time with me, it's because you want to, not because you feel obligated by all the money you've given us over the years." "Rebecca, I never felt obligated. Maybe not consciously, but I think I felt obligated, and that poisoned things for both of us. I want us to start fresh, as equals." Susan considered this. The money had always been given freely, but Rebecca was right that it had created an imbalance in our relationship. An imbalance that had allowed Rebecca to take Susan's generosity for granted, while preventing Susan from making legitimate demands on her daughter's time and attention. "Okay," Susan said. "If it's important to you, then yes. But no interest and no rush. Pay me back when and how you can." "Deal." They shook hands solemnly, and then both of them started laughing at the formality of it. "We're ridiculous," Rebecca said. "Completely," Susan agreed. "But we're figuring it out." The flight home was delayed, giving them extra hours in the airport to talk. They found a quiet corner and settled in with coffee and books, content to simply be in each other's company. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Everything we've been talking about for months has been personal." "True, but this is different." Rebecca closed her book and turned to face Susan fully. "Are you dating anyone?" Susan nearly choked on her coffee. "Dating? I'm 68 years old. So what? 68 isn't dead. You're attractive, intelligent, financially independent. You have your own life now. Are you meeting people?" The question caught Susan completely off guard. In all her thinking about rebuilding her life, romance had never entered the picture. "I haven't really thought about it," Susan admitted. "Maybe you should. You've spent 30 years focused on being my mother. Maybe it's time to think about being Susan." "I am being Susan. You're being independent Susan, recovered from surgery Susan, setting boundaries Susan. But are you being woman who might want companionship Susan?" Susan stared at her daughter, amazed by the conversation they were having. "When did you get so wise about relationships?" "When I almost destroyed the most important one in my life and had to learn how to build it back, from scratch." That evening, back in her own condo, Susan looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Really looked, for the first time in years. She saw silver hair that caught the light, eyes that were clearer and more peaceful than they had been in decades, skin that showed her age but also her health. She saw a woman who had survived, who had learned, who had grown. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe there were still chapters of her life waiting to be written that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Summer brought changes Susan hadn't expected. The memoir she'd been working on found its way to a small publisher through her writing group connections. Nothing dramatic, it wouldn't make her rich or famous, but it would be published, and that felt like a validation of this new life she'd built. Rebecca threw her a small publication party, inviting Susan's writing group friends, Maria, Janet, and a few neighbors from the condo building. Susan watched her daughter move through the gathering, making genuine conversation with these people who had become important to Susan's life, and felt a deep satisfaction. Rebecca was learning to care about the things that mattered to Susan, not just the ways Susan could be useful to her. David pulled Susan aside during the party. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For what?" "For going along with Rebecca's treatment of you for all those years, for benefiting from your generosity without ever thinking about what we were giving back." Susan studied her son-in-law's face. He looked older, more serious than she remembered. "What's made you think about it now?" "Watching Rebecca change, seeing how much happier she is now that she's learned to have an actual relationship with you instead of just managing me as a resource. And realizing that I've been doing the same thing my whole adult life, with my parents, with Rebecca, with you, taking advantage of people's generosity without ever thinking about reciprocity. And now I'm trying to learn what Rebecca learned. That relationships require actual effort and attention, not just showing up when you need something." It was, Susan realized, the longest and most honest conversation she'd ever had with David. "I appreciate that, Aishida. And I appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you for inviting me, for still treating me like family even after everything. You are family, David. But family is something we choose to be, not something we're entitled to." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Rebecca approached Susan with a small wrapped gift. "One more surprise," she said. Inside was a framed photo of Susan at her writing class, surrounded by her new friends, pen in hand, clearly engaged in animated discussion about someone's work. "You look like yourself, really yourself," Rebecca said. Susan studied the photo, seeing what her daughter saw. A woman fully present in her own life, contributing to something meaningful, surrounded by people who valued her thoughts and opinions. "When did you take this?" "I didn't. Janet did last week when she visited your class. She sent it to me because she said it captured something important about who you've become." Susan hugged her daughter, feeling the solid warmth of their rebuilt relationship. "Thank you tonight for all of this.
Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to learn how to love someone better." As Susan got ready for bed that night, she reflected on the evening. A year ago, she'd been recovering from surgery, feeling abandoned and invisible. Tonight, she'd been surrounded by people who cared about her well-being, her achievements, her happiness. The transformation wasn't just in her circumstances. It was in her understanding of what she deserved from life, from family, from herself. Her phone buzzed with the text message, Rebecca, sent from the car on her way home. Thank you for being my mom in all the ways that matter. I'm proud to be your daughter." Susan read the message twice, then set the phone aside and smiled into the darkness. It had taken 68 years and a knee surgery, but she'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being loved, between giving everything and giving appropriately, between sacrifice and boundaries. Most importantly, she'd learned that it was never too late to start living the life she actually wanted, rather than the life she thought would make other people happy. Outside her window, the city hummed with the quiet energy of evening. Somewhere out there were other women learning to set boundaries, other families rebuilding relationships, other people discovering that love looked different than they'd been taught. Susan fell asleep that night, not to the sound of silence, but to the gentle symphony of a life fully lived.